Well, thank you for joining us for our 8:30 service this morning. We are glad you are here, even in all this humidity. And I know it's humid for two reasons. Number one, my hair's starting to curl. Number two, both of them are starting to curl. And number two, my notes were starting to stick together this morning, and I was afraid I was going to skip a page and shorten you the sermon, and I didn't want to do that. So I wanted to be sure they would work. In his book, A Hidden Wholeness, The Journey Toward an Undivided Life, Parker Palmer relates a story about farmers in the Midwest who would prepare for blizzards by tying a rope from the back door of their house to the barn as a guide to ensure they could return safely home. In a raging blizzard, when one cannot see his hand in front of his face, disorientation can happen quickly, and even worse, a person could eventually freeze to death if outside for very long. Well, there are guidelines in the Bible to help us from getting disoriented spiritually. Between this life and the next one, blizzards of activity can swirl around us, and if we don't have a good guide, we can become lost. Now, today's message is entitled, Getting the Sabbath Right. This is the fourth sermon in the series, Anchored, When Mind and Emotions Drift. And we're looking at some biblical principles to help us to be healthier mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And today's message is about developing a sense of rhythm in our lives so that we are not swallowed up by the blizzards that suddenly hit. It's inevitable that storms are going to blow into our lives, but we can get through them when we know that God has a rope for us to keep from getting ourselves lost. So the idea of rhythm and Sabbath in our lives become anchors for living in the hurricane of the demands that can hit. Hebrews 6:19 has been our theme verse throughout this series. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. I do my sermon planning about 1 year in advance, and I'll typically take a week to 10 days and get away, usually in October or November, and plan the preaching schedule out for the next calendar year. When I did my planning week back in 2019, I wrote down a series for 2020 that was going to be entitled Living with Margin. Now, the series Living with Margin was going to be a 6-week sermon series, and so I obtained several books, a lot of resources about the topic. But when the pandemic hit in March of 2020, I scrapped my original plans and revised them, leaving out the series Living with Margin. Because if you remember, we all were home for an awful long time together, and I didn't want to hear any more about living with margin, so I dumped that. And so we had to adapt to new routines created by the pandemic. So what I'm telling you is this: today's sermon is kind of a condensed version of that entire sermon series. So I want you to listen carefully because I'm covering 6 sermons in one today, okay? Now, for some here, your life has been based on what you do. And there have been times you get overscheduled, you get too preoccupied, you get fatigued, you get starved for time. And even a lot of Christians live in some guilt if they think they are wasting time and they're not being productive. Not all addictions are to drugs or to alcohol. Those are tangible items. Some addictions are to intangible items. People get addicted to task and to work and busyness. And certainly there are going to be times that life is busier than others. There are seasons of intensity and there are seasons of rest. But for one's best health, understanding and developing a rhythm that honors God, provides for a family's need, and does not overload oneself is necessary. There's a Peanuts cartoon where Lucy is offering one of her unsolicited observations to Charlie Brown. And she says, life, she muses, is like a deck chair. Some places so they can see where they are going. Some places so they can see where they have been. And some places so they can see where they are in the present. And Charlie Brown replies, I can't even get mine unfolded. Let's study some scriptures about the Sabbath and hopefully learn some principles that'll benefit each one of us. The Word of God needs to be our guide daily so that when life storms overtake us, we know where to grab some hope. Here's the first principle about Sabbath. Appreciate the principle of Sabbath. Appreciate the principle of Sabbath. God gave a command for Sabbath in the 10 Commandments. In fact, it is the longest of all of the 10 Commandments. Let's look at Exodus chapter 20 and beginning with verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigners residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now, in the Old Testament, there was a direct command about the Sabbath. It is the longest of the 10 Commandments, so God must have thought it was very important. And remember, God gives us commandments for our benefit, not for our displeasure. And so the Old Testament was clear. Do not work on the Sabbath. And since God rested on the seventh day from creation, his people were then to rest on Saturday. Now, did God need a nap? No. He changed his pace. He set the example of what we are to do. Do you remember when God started providing manna from heaven every day for the Israelites as they were wandering in the wilderness? You remember the principle of what happened? If they collected more manna than they needed for that one day, the extra would spoil. But on Saturday, the seventh day, no manna fell from the heavens. So they were allowed to collect extra on Friday, and it would not spoil over into Saturday. But if a person did not prepare for the Sabbath, they would go hungry on that extra day. Why did God do that? It was a tangible way for his people to show their trust in him. And understand, God is not advocating here laziness. Proverbs talks about the sluggard who lies around doing nothing and expecting entitlements all the time. The Apostle Paul was very clear to the Thessalonians, if you do not work, you do not eat. So Sabbath isn't about laziness. The word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word meaning stop. There's to be a period in every person's life when there is stopping. You give up working for a period. You enjoy time with God. You allow your body to rest. And the foundation of Sabbath in the Old Testament was two things: worship and rest. And that required trusting God to provide. So Adam and Eve legitimately worked, and then they enjoyed their achievements in the garden. But they were to embrace the limits that God gave to them. They were not to eat from the tree of knowledge and evil. They were to trust God in that. They were not to overwork. They were to trust God in that. They were to learn to rest on the Sabbath, and they were to trust God in that. James Loder, in his book, The Logic of the Spirit, says, we have difficulty with this command because of sin. We refuse to accept God's intended rhythm for our lives. He writes, we imitate God by stopping our work and resting. If we can stop for one day a week or for many Sabbaths each day, we touch something deep within us as image bearers of God. Our human brains, our bodies, our spirits, and our emotions become wired by God for the rhythm of work and rest in him. Over at the Newark Heath Airport is an interesting piece of history. I have a friend who is a pilot. He's taken me in his plane from that airport a couple of times. It's been kind of enjoyable. But in earlier aviation history, there used to be a network of concrete arrows that were used so pilots could navigate U.S. transcontinental flights at night. And this was the era before radar. So pilots would use these ground-based landmarks for guidance. And beacon towers were placed over or near the arrows so the pilots could easily see them at night and know they were flying in the right direction. Well, one of those arrows and towers still exists over at the Newark Heath Airport. It was beacon number 2 of the Columbus to Philadelphia route. Now, I have heard that beacon number 1 of that route used to be right over here where is now Beechwood Trails. It's no longer there, but I know the spot is supposedly still marked where it used to be. But for a pilot to ignore those arrows and their direction could mean getting lost. And obviously, if they got lost and went down on fuel, it could be disastrous. Well, the Sabbath is God's arrow for us. It is God's way of giving direction to his people to learn to trust him over their own abilities. And the question is, do we believe we know more than the one who created us? Well, so the day of rest that God desired for his people was to include worship. Some of the Psalms, if you look through this book of Psalms, all 150 of them, there are several of them that say underneath the chapter number, a song for the Sabbath day. Just as an artist occasionally needs to step back from the canvas to get a more encompassing view of his work, so God provided the Sabbath so that his people could step back and get the bigger picture of life. Sabbath is for realigning our priorities. It's to adjust our schedules. It's for reaffirming our values. Now, there were some Jews who were very legalistic about the Sabbath, and so they started imposing extremes on people. Now, that happens today. Somebody comes up with a good guideline, they come up with a good principle, and somebody wants to make a policy or a rule out of it. Think, for example, of diets. Think of a diet. There's a good diet, and suddenly somebody is at the table with their phone, and they're counting their fat grams so meticulously, they make the meal miserable for everybody. You're just wanting to sit there and eat it, enjoy it, and they're going, you know how many fat grams that has? I don't care how many fat grams that has. And you just want to grab a big roll and put it in their mouth for them. Well, some Jews started listing ways to break the Sabbath. And eventually, they came up with a list of 1,502 ways that the Sabbath could be broken. For example, a Jew that was a scribe, the ones that did the writing, a scribe could not carry a pen on the Sabbath because that was considered work. You were not permitted to kill a flea or a mosquito on the Sabbath because that was considered work. I hate to tell you, if a mosquito lands on my forearm here, I'm going to slap that thing silly. It's going away. A woman was not permitted to look in a mirror on the Sabbath because she might see a gray hair and want to pull it out, and that would be considered working. So ladies, you could not look in a mirror on the Sabbath because you might start accidentally working. Now, that's not a problem for some today because there are some who have a chemical dependency for follicle coloring, and so it would not be quite as a need today. But this command of Sabbath raises questions. Are we still obligated to obey it? Should we worship God on Saturday? Should we worship Him on Sunday? What is work? What is rest? Oh, in the New Testament, the Sabbath becomes an applied principle. Jesus was accused of breaking the Sabbath several times by the Pharisees. Again, the Pharisees were the strict group of the Jews. And if you look over in Luke chapter 6, there is an incident here where he talks about the Sabbath. Luke 6, verse 1. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for the priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So rubbing the grain in their hands was considered work. And thereby, the Pharisees said these disciples broke the Sabbath. Later on, if you read just a few more verses, Jesus healed a man's withered hand in the synagogue, and the Pharisees accused Jesus of breaking the Sabbath. A doctor would be considered working on the Sabbath if he tried to bind up a wound, so the hurt person, if hurt on the Sabbath, was to wait until the next day. The command about the Sabbath is the only of the 10 commandments that is not repeated in the New Testament. So the early Christians were certainly not bound by the Sabbath command. They began, in fact, meeting on the first day of the week, on Sunday. It changed because they were then celebrating Jesus Christ's resurrection from the grave. One author years ago said, the seventh day was a celebration of God's finished creation. Then Christians worshiping on Sunday, the first day of the week, became the way to celebrate God's finished redemption. Now let's say you have a rich uncle, and in 2019 he wrote a will and you were not included in it. But during the pandemic, you really helped him out a lot. And so he wrote a new will this year, and he includes you in it. Remember, he is a rich uncle, and he's going to leave you $5 million. And you just found out yesterday he passed away. Which of those two wills is in effect? It's the second one, praise God, and you're rich. So don't forget, tithe on it if you get it. Hebrews 4, verses 9 and 10 says, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his." See, the principle of Sabbath is still continued in the New Testament. And I think the failure to apply the principle of Sabbath is one of the reasons we have so much physical, moral, emotional, and domestic breakdown in our world today. You appreciate the principle of Sabbath and learn to build in your schedule times of planned rest, times of renewal. I heard a preacher one time say at a conference several years back, learn to divert daily, walk away weekly, and abandon annually. Take a few minutes every day to allow your brain to rest. Take a day off every week and walk away from your vocation. Take vacations regularly and do not neglect the time you need to rejuvenate yourself. Well, here's the second principle. Balance your life to avoid extremes. Appreciate the principle of Sabbath that God has, and then balance your life to avoid extremes. The late preacher Wayne Smith out of Lexington, Kentucky, when he had been preaching at the Southland Church there for about 30 years, one weekend his mother came in to visit her son and her grandchildren, and Wayne said, my mother was very legalistic. She was strict. And he said, on the way home after church on a Sunday night, remember when we used to have church on Sunday night? He said, after church on a Sunday night, he stopped at a Baskin-Robbins to get some ice cream. And he said, I started to get out of the car, and my mother, who was sitting in the back seat, said, Wayne, since when did we start buying ice cream on the Lord's Day? And he said, we don't, Mother. And he got back in and took her home. After his mother went to bed, he got back in the car and went to Baskin-Robbins. Wayne Smith said, God is full of grace, but my mother wasn't. Now, the problem with our practicing the principle of Sabbath usually isn't being that legalistic. It's going to the other extreme, and we forget the purpose of Sabbath. Because the purpose of Sabbath is worship and rest. Sundays now get used for almost everything but worship. The excuse for not being in church are such a long list nowadays, and I'm not talking about non-Christians. I'm talking about those who claim to be Christ's followers. And in the New Testament, worshipers of Jesus gathered every week to connect with one another and to commune with God. Is there any of us here today that are so spiritual that we don't need to be here? Now, somebody said, well, I feel a little resentful about that. Well, Doctors Henry Cloud and John Townsend in their book Boundary says, if you feel resentful about that, that's probably the first warning signal that your life's already getting out of balance. I love Chick-fil-A. I love their food. I love their principles. I ate there. I was down in Kentucky on Friday and came back Friday evening and just so happened stopped in Georgetown, Kentucky and ate at Chick-fil-A. I love that they are closed on Sundays. Actually, I just lied. I really wish they were open on Sundays. I wish we could go there after church. But they have stayed committed to providing a day for worship and rest for their employees. And Hobby Lobby does the same. And both chains are very profitable. In fact, Chick-fil-A is the most profitable fast food chain in our country today, and they are still closed one day a week. A few years ago, I had a speaking engagement over in St. Louis, and then I was to fly to Florida that Sunday afternoon to visit an aunt and uncle of mine. And so I had a direct flight from Columbus on Friday to St. Louis, so I preached that Sunday morning, and then I caught a flight to Orlando, but there weren't any nonstop flights from St. Louis to Orlando on Sundays on Southwest. All of their flights required a layover. Well, my layover was in Birmingham, Alabama. I'd never been to Birmingham, Alabama. The airport there is very small. At least it used to be. This was about 10 years ago. I mean, the whole gate area was like the size of this room. That was it. And there were three gates, one in the middle and one on either corner. And so I'm there, and there's only one place to eat inside that gate area, and it was Chick-fil-A. But it's Sunday, so Chick-fil-A was closed. There was a vending machine in front of Chick-fil-A. The vending machine did not dispense Chick-fil-A. In fact, I got a sandwich out of there. It didn't even dispense anything that tasted like chicken. It was bad. Why do we think we have more wisdom than the one who created us? Now, obviously, certain vocations require working on Sundays. There's nursing and there's delivery companies and other things, but even they provide days off throughout the week. Now, obviously, for a preacher, Sunday's not a good Sabbath. It's not a day of rest. I try to take Fridays off during the week. I try not to be legalistic about it, but I try to be more so now than I used to be. I try not to answer my cell on Fridays and not to respond to emails or return voicemail calls. I had a voicemail a week ago Friday, and when I came in on Saturday to look over my sermon notes, I saw the light flashing on my phone. I listened to the voicemail. It was not urgent. And so I thought, you know what, I can wait. I can return that call later on. For some, the idea of taking a day off is to cram as much activity into that day as possible. Chores around the house, games and school activities, a few hours at the lake, or you race to your parents and back again on the same day. Maybe even this morning you raced into church, you kind of tipped your hat to God. If it goes over 5 minutes past an hour, you get restless because you can't stop mentally. And frankly, I cannot reach you because you don't know what it is to stop and to be still and to know God. A little boy got up on Saturday morning and he saw his dad with his laptop at the dining room table and he said, "Dad, what are you doing?" He said, "Son, I had so much work on my job this week, I had to get it done, so I brought some home with me." And the little boy said, "Dad, when you go to work on Monday, why don't you go to your boss and ask him to put you in a slower group?" Some of us need to be put in a slower group. Do your practices reflect what you claim about your priorities? One of the responsibilities a Christian parent has is to teach and model a balanced Sabbath to their children. Do you make sure they get the rest needed for their physical bodies? You have your child in so many activities, there's rarely much downtime. Years ago, we had a father in our church who thought his son could make the major leagues in baseball. And his son was a very good baseball player. But they went to a statewide meeting at Wright State University over in Dayton, and there were 1,500 baseball players high school baseball players from the state, all mid-teens, and a major league coach got up and opened with, said, "You are here today because either you or your parents think you are heading towards a major league baseball career." He said, "I just want to let you know in this auditorium, one person might make it." He said, "Be sure you have other options for your kids." Was there too much time given to just one physical activity? Do you provide rest for their emotions? In other words, do you see your children laugh? Do you see them cry? Do they understand emotions are for feeling and they're not for thinking? There's a very famous picture from 6 decades ago now at the funeral of President John F. Kennedy when his then 3-year-old son, John F. Kennedy Jr., is standing and saluting his father's caskets. But he was fighting back the tears, and yet he was informed as a 3-year-old, "You are a Kennedy. Kennedys don't cry." And that was an extreme statement to make to a 3-year-old boy who had just lost his father. That is not healthy. Do your children get rest for their minds? Are you guarding that they don't become so overdriven that they're never allowed time for rest and recreation? Tim Kimmel has out a book from about 2 decades ago entitled Little House on the Freeway, and he says that parents are to draw children to their best, not push them beyond their limits. Do you provide for your children spiritually? If bringing your children to church is your only investment into them spiritually, you're probably a long way off. Tim Kimmel writes, "I'm shocked how often and how badly parents drop the ball in this dimension. It's almost as if they don't acknowledge the spiritual dimension's existence." So children need the stability of loving parents, biblical truth, and an active faith life that helps them to learn more about God, about the church, and how Jesus Christ can make a difference in their lives. So make the worship of God your number one priority and build your life around relationships and in practical expressions with that. The worship of God should help the marriage relationship. It should help you to be a better parent. It should help you to be a better employee. It should help you mentally and emotionally. See, if our minds never get a break, if we're always thinking about work, or we're always trying to solve a problem all day long at home or at school, they eventually reach a point of breakdown. Balance is knowing when to engage and when to disengage. If you are driving down the highway and you keep one foot on the brake the whole time, that's eventually going to cause a problem. And the worship of God helps you to rejuvenate yourself and helps provide stability. If you're going to keep balance in your life, it has to start with the first part of the command about the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Make a commitment that you're going to be here every Sunday unless you're out of town. Don't expect all your other priorities to go well throughout the week if you don't get the spiritual one correct. Appreciate the principle of Sabbath. Balance your life to avoid extremes. And then finally, create boundaries in your life. Create boundaries in your life. To say yes to the major priorities that need to occur in your life, guess what? It means you have to say no to some other things. Jesus even said, you let your yes be yes, you let your no be no. There are all kinds of applications I could make here. In fact, I started writing down a whole bunch of them. I came up with like 18 or 19 of them, but that's way too long. And so I finally narrowed it down to 2 that I think will be beneficial. Now, maybe these applications are maybe more for me than they are you, but they should help strengthen a person's mental and emotional well-being by trying to engage the principle of Sabbath. Here's the first one. Create boundaries in your life by sometimes taking the slow lane and observing. Create boundaries in your life by sometimes taking the slow lane and observing. By the way, the slow lane is not always about the speed of the traffic in which you find yourself. Jimmy Buffett sings, riding in the slow, slow lane, throttling down, riding in the slow, slow lane, taking time to look around, riding in the slow, slow lane, life's the blink of an eye, my, riding in the slow, slow lane, blue angels paint the sky. Now, we know medically that allowing our bodies and minds to have a rest are good. We can reduce stress, we can improve our moods, we can decrease our blood pressure, we can lessen chronic pain, we can improve our immune system, we can strengthen the cardiovascular system. Who would have ever thought a nap could do all of that? And you know what? For some of you sitting here today, there are some of you here right now, the most spiritual thing you could do today is take a long nap and allow your body and your mind some rest. Just don't start it right now during the sermon. You can wait a little bit. Even Jesus pulled away from the crowds to allow himself some solitude because he wanted to effectively minister to the crowds when he was needed. There was one day in Jesus' ministry that was very busy. He taught in the Capernaum synagogue. He confronted and he cast out a demon. He healed Peter's mother-in-law. He cast out some more demons, and then he healed some more people. And Mark's gospel says the whole city gathered at the door because they had seen what he'd done and more people wanted more healings. How did Jesus do all of that? Mark 1 verse 35 says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Wayne Mueller wrote a book entitled Sabbath, Restoring the Sacred Rhythm of Rest. He writes, for every living thing, there's the necessity of dormancy, the deep rhythm of work and rest. And when we're traveling at a high speed, there's a subtle sense of undernourishment because even good things we're doing don't have time to sink in. We've gotten to the point where the only culturally accepted reason to stop entirely is when we get sick. And that's a terrible thing, simply because we have forgotten this principle of a Sabbath rest. When's the last time you deliberately slowed down? You drove in the slow lane. You're at the grocery store and you got in the longest checkout line, not the slowest, not the shortest. You guard your meal times from interruptions. When's the last time you just said no? Stephen Hopkins has a little book entitled How to Say No. He says we're often afraid to say no because we don't want to offend others. We want to avoid conflict. We don't want to disappoint. We want people to like us, or we just have a people-pleasing habit. So create boundaries in your life by sometimes taking the slow lane and observing. Maybe it's something as simple as taking your lunch and going to a park. Just watch other people walk by. Here's another suggestion application. Create boundaries in your life by occasionally limiting your digital engagement. Create boundaries in your life by occasionally limiting your digital engagement. Now, I think we all would acknowledge technology is great today. We can have information at our fingertips in seconds. Your grocery list is on your phone. You got your contact list on your phone. You can look up the weather. You can tell when it's going to rain in the next 15 minutes or not. You can carry your flight information on your phone. You can have a map to your next destination on your phone. You can make reservations. You can find out where the nearest restaurant is. You can go online and check in at a restaurant where you want to go after church on Sunday. You can find out where the nearest Starbucks is. You can find out where the nearest Sheetz gas station is so you can buy the cheapest gas and get it for $4.50 instead of $4.89. And so you can find out all that things on one device. Henry Cloud, in his book Boundaries, writes that when he was a kid, he was a very competitive golfer, and he would spend a lot of time on the golf course, especially in the summer. And one of the regular players at the course was a doctor who routinely came by the course in the middle of the day. And he wasn't there every day, and he wasn't there all day when he was. But it didn't seem like he had a real job, according to Henry Cloud. He said he just hung out a lot at the golf course. He said, that is a pretty cool job. I thought playing golf almost every day. And one day Henry Cloud asked him, said, how can you be here and not be at work? And the doctor said, I am at work. Now, this is a little bit older story. He pointed at the pager on his belt. He said, I work emergencies, and they page me when needed. The hospital's only 2 minutes away. Since they can reach me when I'm on call, it frees me to be here until a surgery is needed. Cloud wrote, wow, how cool is this? To be at work without being at work. That's the kind of job I want someday. But then Cloud writes, be careful what you wish for. Fast forward a few decades ahead, and being on call, reachable anytime, anywhere, by anyone, is a routine fact of life. And he says, not just for me, but for all of us, including kids as well as adults. The technology we have today is great. There are so many great benefits. Right after I got my first cell phone, I was making a hospital visit down on Broad Street at Mount Carmel East, and while I was there, I got another call that a member was being rushed to the ER there. And so I was able to meet that person downstairs in the ER. How is that for pastoral support? I got there before the patient did. That is good. But a relative who was driving behind the squad asked me, how in the world did you get here so fast? So I lied. And then I eventually told him the truth, that somebody called me from the office and said, you need to be at the hospital to see what's going on with this person. But while the digital age in which we live can be wonderful, and it is often handy at times, it can be a drain. It can absorb huge amounts of time. It can cause work to not get done. It can be treated as the primary way to relate with others. It can cause tremendous social media drama. Somebody said it used to be our phones were in our lives, but now our lives are on our phones. And for some, living digitally is a hyper increased stress due to what's called FOMO, fear of missing out. It's the anxiety that somebody feels when they fear something important may be occurring, which they're not aware. It usually deals with somebody's social life. Facebook, emails, text, Instagram, Snapchat, all of those are great. But they all can prevent our minds from getting the downtime they need to. So limiting your digital engagement might mean your phone's turned off at relationship times, when you're having family dinner, date night, social gatherings, conversations with friends. When you're at work and you need to focus, you only check your email related to the project at hand. You turn off everything else. You limit your time on social media. You give the beginning and the ending of the day to the Lord. Maybe say for 30 minutes when I get up and 30 minutes before I go to bed, I'm not going to have any digital engagement. Andy Crouch has written a book entitled The Tech-Wise Family, Everyday Steps for Putting Technology in its Proper Place. Crouch decided, though, he didn't want the book to be about screen time or limits. He wanted the book to be about our desires. What do we really want from our lives and for our children and our grandchildren, our nephews and nieces, our neighbors? Now, Crouch in his book is not opposed to modern technology and how it's enriched our lives, but he's concerned about how it's caused us to disengage and distract ourselves. And then he addresses the spiritual aspect of digital technology. He says the people we are meant to be can only be found in the words of Jesus when he was asked, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus answered, the first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There's no other commandment greater than these. And Crouch fears our devices are starting to place obstacles in the way of having focused engagement needed to love God and our neighbors with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And he suggests that we need a heart, soul, mind, strength complex, because he says the four are bound together inextricably. We are beings who are emotional, spiritual, mental, and physical, and we need all of those to be at their best to love God like we should. So this morning, as we prepare our hearts for communion, we're going to spend just a few minutes, a couple of minutes, in guided prayer. And then I'm going to lead a prayer before we sing. Peter Scazzaro writes, Sabbath is stopping to breathe the air of eternity. Sabbath is stopping to breathe the air of eternity. Have you taken a deep breath recently? Let's pray. This morning, begin thinking about how you can prioritize God in your life this week. As you pray to Him, think of something you could purge this week to allow more focused time with God or with family or in a relationship. What is something you could just get rid of this week? Think of a time when maybe you could just place your phone aside more this week, where typically you may have it with you and you could just turn it over and put it away for a while. And when is there some time this week you could process some time for slowing down? Just giving yourself some time to breathe in the air of eternity. And when could you this week profess that you need some more time to focus on eternity more than just the right now? God, all of us need some time to breathe into the air of eternity and to begin to allow the air of eternity to flow into us. As we think about our relationship with you and with your Son, may we not distract ourselves from the priority of knowing you in a deeper and a richer way. There are many things that can cloud our minds, can distract our thoughts, but in spite of all those, may we slow down and have some Sabbath to worship and to rest. And we know that it was possible that Jesus went to the cross only because He had the inner ability to slow down, to know why you had called Him, to know why He was here, that He was headed for the cross. And He got there because of your plan, but because of His being obedient to your will in His life. May that be our goal, to be obedient to what you desire for us. In Jesus' name, amen.